Chapter 1. The Fateful Morning. January 28, 1986. The Kennedy Space Center, Cape Canaveral, Florida. Darkness still clings to the humid salt marsh air, but it is a brittle, unnatural darkness, sharpened by a cold that has no business being here. A Siberian air mass, a polar vortex, has descended upon the Sunshine State, plunging temperatures to a record-breaking low. The air is crystalline, biting. It feels alien. On Launch Complex 39B, a monument to human ambition stands silhouetted against the pre-dawn sky. The Space Shuttle Challenger, mated to its colossal external tank and twin solid rocket boosters, is a gleaming white specter under the powerful xenon floodlights. It seems to exhale ghostly plumes of vapor, not from its engines, but from the super-chilled liquid oxygen and hydrogen fuel coursing through its veins. But something else is visible, something unsettling and strange. The launch tower, a lattice of steel girders, is draped in thick, jagged curtains of ice. Icicles, some several feet long, hang like daggers, glistening menacingly. The service structure looks like a frozen waterfall, a structure of the Arctic, not the subtropics. This is not a normal Florida morning, and this is not a normal spaceflight. Inside the operations and checkout building, 7 figures are making their final preparations. They are the crew of STS-51L, Commander Dick Scobie, a veteran pilot with a calm demeanor and an easy smile. Pilot Michael J. Smith, a Navy captain on his first spaceflight, meticulous and focused. The 3 mission specialists, Judith Resnick, a brilliant electrical engineer with a cascade of dark curls, the second American woman in space, Ronald McNair, a physicist with a PhD from MIT, a gifted saxophonist who planned to play a solo from orbit, and Ellison Onizuka, the first Asian American in space, a quiet, respected Air Force test pilot. Alongside them are 2 payload specialists, Gregory Jarvis, an engineer for Hughes Aircraft, who had been bumped from 2 previous flights, his chance finally here, and Krista McAuliffe, a high school social studies teacher from Concord, New Hampshire, a wife, a mother of 2, chosen from over 11,000 applicants to be the first citizen, the first teacher in space. She carries the hopes and dreams of a nation's classrooms with her. Her presence has transformed this mission from a routine satellite deployment into a national event. Millions, especially school children, will be watching today because of her. They move with practiced efficiency, a ballet of preparation they have rehearsed for months, donning their iconic light blue flight suits. They exchange quiet words, jokes, and reassurances. The mood is one of controlled excitement, the culmination of years of training and lifelong dreams. But outside, the cold is a silent, growing concern. Engineers have been working through the night, their breath fogging in the frigid air as they inspect the launch pad. The ice is a known hazard. Falling chunks could damage the shuttle's fragile thermal tiles upon liftoff. An ice team is dispatched to knock down the most dangerous formations, their hammers echoing in the cold stillness. But the ice on the tower is only the visible manifestation of the problem. The real danger lies deep within the machinery, in the unseen joints of the solid rocket boosters, where the cold is quietly, relentlessly, compromising the very seals that are meant to contain 3 million pounds of thrust. The 7 astronauts emerge, waving to the cameras as they board the Astrovans for the short ride to the launch pad. They are smiling, composed, projecting the confidence that the world expects of them. They are the embodiment of the right stuff, but beneath the surface there are currents of unease. The launch has already been delayed multiple times for weather, for technical glitches. This morning, the cold is the primary topic of conversation among the engineers and managers who hold the fate of this mission in their hands. A tense, heated debate had taken place the night before, a debate that would later become the central focus of a national investigation. Engineers had warned, pleaded, that launching in these temperatures was to risk catastrophe. They argued that the rubber O-rings sealing the booster segments would become hard and brittle, failing to seal the gap filled with incandescent gas burning at over 5,000 degrees Fahrenheit. Their warnings were overruled. The pressure to launch, to maintain a busy flight schedule and prove the shuttle was a reliable operational vehicle, was immense. As the Astrovan delivers the crew to the base of Pad 39B, they look up at the towering white stack, a vertical cathedral of technology. They know the risks. Every astronaut does. They accept them as part of the price for pushing the boundaries of human experience. But they do not know, they cannot know, that a specific well-documented and preventable risk has been accepted on their behalf. They ascend the gantry elevator, cross the crew access arm, and one by one disappear into the circular hatch of the Challenger's crew cabin. Strapped into their seats, they run through the final pre-flight checklists, their voices calm and professional over the communication loops. Dick Scobie, Mike Smith, Judy Resnick, Ron McNair, Ellison Onizuka, Greg Jarvis, Krista McAuliffe. 7 lives, 7 distinct journeys, all converging on this single point in time and space. In the viewing stands a few miles away, their families huddle together for warmth, their faces a mixture of pride, anxiety and anticipation. Krista's parents, Ed and Grace Corrigan, are there. Her husband Stephen and their 2 children, Scott and Caroline, are there, surrounded by Krista's students from Concord High, who have been bussed down to witness their teacher make history. They hold signs and cheer, their breath misting in the cold air. They, like the rest of the world, see only the promise of the moment. They are unaware of the debate over O-rings, of the engineers' fears, of the compromise that has been made in a conference room hundreds of miles away. The countdown clock ticks relentlessly backward. T-minus 9 minutes and counting. The final polls are conducted. All systems are go. The crew access arm retracts, pulling away from the shuttle, leaving it standing alone, free to meet its destiny. The sky begins to lighten in the east, painting the horizon in shades of orange and pink, but the air remains brutally cold. Inside the cockpit, Commander Scobie's voice is heard. Chapter 2. A Dream of the Stars. To understand the forces that placed Challenger on the launch pad that frozen January morning, we must rewind the clock. We must look back to an era of grand ambition and political turmoil, to the very genesis of the space transportation system, or as the world would come to know it, the Space Shuttle. The year is 1969. Neil Armstrong takes his giant leap for mankind, and America stands triumphant, the undisputed victor of the space race. The Apollo program is the nation's crowning achievement, a testament to what can be accomplished when vision, resources, and national will are aligned. But Apollo was breathtakingly expensive. It was a program of singular purpose, to put a man on the moon and bring him home safely. It was a series of bespoke one-off missions, each rocket built for a single glorious flight, before being discarded into the ocean. It was magnificent, but it was not sustainable. In the post-Vietnam, post-Watergate era of the early 1970s, the political and economic climate in America was shifting dramatically. The national appetite for massive Apollo-style government spending was waning. NASA, facing brutal budget cuts, knew it needed a new vision, a new promise, to ensure its survival. The dream that emerged was not one of exploration, but of utility. The future of space, they argued, was not in planting flags, but in building an orbital economy. The key was to make spaceflight routine, affordable, and frequent. The answer was a reusable spaceplane, a workhorse vehicle that could take off like a rocket, operate in orbit like a spacecraft, and land on a runway like an airplane. This was the promise of the Space Shuttle. It was envisioned as a space truck, a celestial cargo hauler that would make access to low Earth orbit as common as a commercial airline flight. NASA projected a launch schedule of up to 60 flights per year, carrying commercial satellites, military payloads, and scientific experiments into orbit for a fraction of the cost of expendable rockets. This ambitious flight rate was the core justification for the program's existence and its enormous development costs. It was a promise that would come to haunt the agency, creating a relentless systemic pressure to launch on schedule, no matter the obstacles. The design of the shuttle itself was a marvel of engineering, but also a monument to compromise. To secure funding from a skeptical Congress and a cost-conscious Nixon administration, NASA had to make significant concessions. The initial vision of a fully reusable 2-stage system was deemed too expensive. Instead, a semi-reusable design was adopted. The orbiter itself would be reusable. The massive external fuel tank, the backbone of the stack, would be discarded on each flight, burning up on re-entry. And the powerful solid rocket boosters, which provided the primary thrust for the first 2 minutes of flight, would be jettisoned parachute into the ocean and be recovered and refurbished for future missions. This decision to use solid rocket boosters instead of more controllable, and arguably safer, liquid-fueled engines was driven almost entirely by cost. Solids were simpler and cheaper to build, but they came with a terrible unyielding drawback: once ignited, they could not be shut down. A solid rocket motor is in essence a controlled explosion. From the moment of ignition until its fuel is exhausted, it burns with unstoppable force. Any flaw in its casing, any leak in its seals, would be instantly and irredeemably catastrophic. The company contracted to build these crucial components was Morton Thiokol, based in Utah. The design they settled on was a sectional one. The massive boosters were too large to be transported as a single piece from Utah to Florida. Instead, they were built in segments, shipped to the Cape, and stacked on top of each other. The joints where these segments met were the shuttle's Achilles heel. They were sealed by a pair of rubber rings, each about a 1/4 inch thick and over 37 feet in circumference, known as O-rings. The entire integrity of the booster, containing the fury of a burning propellant at 5,800 degrees Fahrenheit, depended on these two thin circles of rubber. For over a decade, the shuttle program moved from blueprint to reality. The prototype Enterprise performed glide tests in 1977. Then, on April 12, 1981, the Space Shuttle Columbia roared to life, carrying astronauts John Young and Robert Crippen on a triumphant maiden voyage. The 1980s became the decade of the shuttle. It was a symbol of American technological prowess and optimism in the Reagan era. The fleet grew. Columbia was joined by Challenger, then Discovery, then Atlantis. The sight of the shuttle arcing into the sky became a familiar, almost routine, spectacle. But the promise of 60 flights a year proved to be a fantasy. The turnaround time for the orbiters was far longer than anticipated. The system was infinitely more complex and fragile than the initial sales pitch had suggested. By 1985, NASA was struggling to achieve even 9 flights a year. The pressure from the White House, from Congress, and from commercial and military clients was immense. Launch fevers began to permeate the agency's culture. Schedules became paramount. A can-do attitude, so essential in the Apollo days, began to morph into a dangerous reluctance to accept bad news or acknowledge delays. It was in this climate of intense operational pressure that NASA conceived of a public relations masterstroke, the Teacher in Spaces program. The idea was simple and brilliant. By sending an ordinary citizen, a teacher, into orbit, NASA could recapture the public's imagination, inspire a new generation of students, and demonstrate the shuttle's safety and reliability. It would transform the perception of spaceflight from a dangerous enterprise for elite test pilots into an accessible frontier for everyone. The announcement by President Reagan in 1984 set off a wave of excitement. More than 11,000 teachers applied. The selection process was rigorous, culminating in the choice of Sharon Krista McAuliffe, a 37-year-old social studies teacher from Concord, New Hampshire. Krista was by all accounts the perfect choice. She was charismatic, articulate, and passionate. Her enthusiasm was infectious. She wasn't a scientist or an engineer. She was an ordinary person with an extraordinary dream. She saw space as the next great frontier, not just for technology, but for history and humanity. She planned to teach lessons from orbit, simple science demonstrations designed to connect with students back on Earth. One was called The Ultimate Field Trip. Her journal entries from her training period reveal a woman in constant awe of the experience, but also deeply committed to her role as an educator. She wrote, "I think the students will be great boosters of the space program. They're the ones who will have the missions to Mars." Krista, along with her backup, Barbara Morgan, began training at the Johnson Space Center in Houston in the fall of 1985. She was quickly embraced by her crewmates, the veteran astronauts of STS-51L. They respected her dedication and her purpose. She wasn't a passenger. She was a valued member of the team, a payload specialist with a specific job to do. Her presence on the mission generated unprecedented media attention. The Challenger launch was scheduled for January 1986, and it was billed as a major national event. Television networks planned live coverage. Schools across the country arranged to have their students watch the launch in classrooms and auditoriums. Krista McAuliffe was about to become the most famous teacher in the world. The dream of the stars, born from the ashes of Apollo, had evolved. It was no longer just about national prestige or scientific discovery. It had become personal. It was about a teacher's promise to her students. It was about showing millions of children that they too could reach for the heavens. This deeply human element, this story of an ordinary person on an extraordinary journey, raised the stakes of the Challenger mission to an unbearable height. It created an unspoken immense pressure not to disappoint, not to delay again. The entire nation was watching, waiting for the teacher to fly. This dream, so pure in its inception, had become entangled in the complex realities of the shuttle program, its budgetary compromises, its operational pressures, and its hidden fatal flaw. Chapter 3. The Cold Truth. Deep within the bureaucratic heart of the Space Shuttle program, a cold truth was beginning to emerge, a truth whispered in engineering memos and debated in technical reviews. It was a truth about rubber, steel, and fire. A truth that, if ignored, would have devastating consequences. The focus of this growing anxiety was the solid rocket booster, or SRB. These were the twin white columns strapped to the side of the shuttle's external tank, the engines that provided over 80% of the thrust at liftoff. Each SRB was a colossal structure, 150 feet tall and 12 feet in diameter, packed with over 1 million pounds of ammonium perchlorate composite propellant. They were, by a significant margin, the largest solid-fuel motors ever flown, and their design contained a secret history of doubt. The problem was the field joints. because the boosters were manufactured in segments in Utah by Morton Thiokol and assembled in Florida, they had to be joined together. The design for this connection was called a tang and clivus joint. One segment had a U-shaped channel, the clivus, and the next segment had a tongue-like extension, the tang, that slotted into it. The gap between the tang and clivus was sealed by two rubber O-rings. The primary O-ring was the main barrier against the inferno of burning fuel. The secondary O-ring was its backup, a redundant seal in case the primary failed. At least, that was the theory. From the very beginning of the shuttle program, this design was a source of concern for some engineers. It was a modification of a design used on the Titan III missile, but the shuttle's boosters were much larger in diameter. This increased size meant that under the immense pressure of ignition, nearly 1,000 pounds per square inch, the steel casing of the booster would bulge and distort. This phenomenon, known as case rotation, caused the tang and clivus to separate slightly, widening the gap that the O-rings had to seal. For the seal to work, the rubber O-ring had to be resilient enough to expand rapidly and fill this widening gap, a process called extrusion. It had to do this in the first 600 milliseconds after ignition, a fraction of a second when the internal pressure was at its peak. If it failed to seal, a pathway would be created for hot gas to escape, a process known as blow-by. This escaping gas, at over 5,000 degrees Fahrenheit, could burn through the O-rings and if it continued, could burn through the steel casing of the booster itself, turning it into a giant, uncontrolled blowtorch aimed directly at the external fuel tank, filled with 500,000 gallons of liquid hydrogen and oxygen. The system's integrity relied entirely on the flexibility and responsiveness of a quarter-inch thick piece of rubber, and the performance of that rubber was critically dependent on temperature. As early as 1977, test firings had shown issues with the O-rings. Post-flight inspections of the recovered boosters from actual shuttle missions began to tell an even more alarming story. Engineers were finding evidence of O-ring erosion. The hot gas was charring and eating away at the rubber. They were also finding soot and grease blown past the primary O-ring, a clear sign that for a brief moment, the primary seal had failed to function. This was blow-by. The secondary O-ring was holding, but the system's redundancy, its margin of safety, was being compromised on nearly every flight. The data was meticulously collected and analyzed by a group of dedicated engineers at Morton Thiokol, chief among them a man named Roger Boisjoli. Boisjoli was an experienced engineer specializing in seals and hydraulics. He was methodical, persistent, and increasingly worried. He saw a pattern in the data that chilled him to the bone. The worst O-ring damage consistently occurred on flights that had launched in cooler weather. The correlation was undeniable. The colder the O-rings were at launch, the less resilient they became. They grew stiff, losing their ability to quickly expand and seal the joint during the crucial first second of flight. The coldest launch to date had been STS-51C, the flight of the Shuttle Discovery in January of 1985. The temperature at launch time was 53 degrees Fahrenheit. When the boosters were recovered from the Atlantic, the inspection was shocking. There was significant blow-by past the primary O-ring in both booster joints. For the first time, engineers saw erosion on the secondary O-ring as well. The system's redundancy had been breached. The hot gas had come terrifyingly close to burning through the final seal. Had the blow-by continued for a fraction of a second longer, Discovery and its crew would have been lost. The incident sent a shockwave through the engineering teams at both Morton Thiokol and NASA's Marshall Space Flight Center in Alabama, which managed the booster program. Boisjoli and his colleagues formed a task force to address the issue. In July of 1985, 6 months before the Challenger flight, Boisjoli wrote a now famous memo to his superiors at Thiokol. The language was urgent and prophetic. He warned that the O-ring problem was getting worse, and that if it were not fixed, the consequences could be dire. He wrote, "It is my honest and very real fear that if we do not take immediate action to dedicate a team to solve the problem, then we stand in jeopardy of losing a flight along with all the launchpad facilities." He concluded with a chilling sentence: the result would be a catastrophe of the highest order, loss of human life. The memo was a desperate plea for resources and attention. But the shuttle program was in the grip of launch fever. The pressure to fly was relentless. The 1986 flight manifest was the most ambitious yet. Any delay in one mission would have a domino effect on all the others. Acknowledging the O-ring problem as a fundamental design flaw that needed to be fixed would mean grounding the fleet for months, perhaps years. It was a truth too expensive, too disruptive to fully confront. Instead of treating the O-ring erosion and blow-by as a sign of impending failure, a culture of normalization of deviance began to take hold. Because the secondary O-ring had always held in the past, the problem was reclassified from a critical safety of flight issue to an acceptable risk. The flaw was no longer seen as a showstopper. It was simply a known manageable characteristic of the system. The engineers' concerns were noted, task forces were formed, and studies were commissioned, but the shuttles kept flying. The warnings from Boisjoli and others were being buried under layers of management and bureaucracy. The system was designed to push paper up, but it was failing to push critical warnings up with the urgency they deserved. As the launch date for STS-51L approached in January 1986, the weather forecast for Florida began to look ominous. An unprecedented cold front was sweeping down the country. The engineers at the Ecole in Utah watched the forecast with growing dread. They knew the temperature at the Cape could drop into the 20s, far colder than any previous launch. They had no data on how the O-rings would perform at such low temperatures. Their tests and flight experience ended at 53 degrees, and even that had been nearly catastrophic. To launch into the 20s or 30s was to step off a cliff into a complete unknown. The cold truth was no longer a theoretical problem to be debated in memos. It was a clear and present danger, a specific threat to the 7 lives sitting in the crew cabin of Challenger. The meticulous data, the troubling flight histories, the urgent memos, all of it was converging on this one flight, on this one frozen morning. The engineers knew they were facing a moment of truth. They had to make their case, to convince management that this was a risk not worth taking, but they would soon find themselves fighting not just against the laws of physics, but against a system that was powerfully, inexorably biased toward launch. Chapter 4. The Point of No Return. In the final hours before the launch of Challenger, the fate of the 7 astronauts would be decided not in the cockpit or on the launch pad, but in a series of tense conference calls between men hundreds of miles apart. It was a clash of cultures, a collision between the cautious, data-driven world of engineering and the schedule-driven world of management. The key players in this drama were not villains, but dedicated professionals, each acting according to their own worldview, each trapped within a flawed system that was pushing them all toward a point of no return. At the heart of the resistance were the engineers at Morton Thiokol in Brigham City, Utah. Roger Boisjoli, the passionate and increasingly distraught SEAL expert, had been living with the fear of an O-ring failure for months. He saw the cold forecast for launch morning not as an inconvenience, but as the materialization of his worst nightmare. He and his colleague, Arnie Thompson, the supervisor of solid rocket motor structures, began frantically gathering their data, preparing to make the most important presentation of their lives. They were supported by their boss, Bob Ebeling, a man who felt the weight of responsibility for the safety of the hardware his team designed. These were men who dealt in physical certainties, in the behavior of materials under stress. For them, the lack of data on O-ring performance below 53 degrees was a black hole of uncertainty, a risk that could not be quantified and therefore should not be taken. Opposing them, though not with malicious intent, were the managers at NASA's Marshall Space Flight Center in Huntsville, Alabama. Larry Malloy was the manager of the Solid Rocket Booster project at Marshall. He was a powerful figure, known for his demanding, no-nonsense style. He was under immense pressure to keep the shuttle program on its ambitious schedule. To him, the Thiokol engineers were raising a concern that had been known and accepted for years. O-ring erosion was a flight-to-flight risk that had been managed before. He needed a definitive, data-backed reason to scrub a launch that was already delayed and under intense public scrutiny. His deputy, George Hardy, shared this perspective. They were program managers tasked with balancing risk, cost, and schedule. From their viewpoint, the engineers had to prove that it was unsafe to fly. The engineers believed the managers had to prove that it was safe. This fundamental difference in perspective, the burden of proof, would become the central conflict of the night. Caught in the middle were the senior executives at Morton Thiokol. Gerald Mason, the senior vice president, was a manager, not an engineer. His primary responsibility was to the company, to its relationship with its biggest client, NASA. He was a man accustomed to making business decisions, to weighing risks and rewards in a corporate context. He would be the ultimate arbiter of his company's recommendation. And then there were the 7 people at the center of it all, oblivious to the debate raging about their safety. The crew of STS-51L. Francis Dick Scobie, the 46-year-old commander, a former Air Force test pilot who had flown combat missions in Vietnam. This was his second shuttle flight. He was known as a cool-headed leader, a pilot's pilot. Michael J. Smith, the pilot, was 40 years old and making his first flight. A decorated Navy combat pilot and test pilot, he had a master's degree in aeronautical engineering. He was the detail-oriented professional, responsible for the orbiter's systems. Judith Resnick, 36, was a mission specialist with a PhD in electrical engineering. A classical pianist and a gourmet cook, she was on her second space flight, a veteran known for her sharp intellect and vibrant personality. Ronald McNair, 35, also a mission specialist, the second African American in space. He held a PhD in physics from MIT and was an expert in laser physics. He was also a 5th-degree black belt in karate and an accomplished saxophonist. He planned to record a piece by Jean-Michel Jarre in orbit, a collaboration that would have been the first original piece of music recorded in space. Ellison Onizuka, 39, missions specialist, an Air Force lieutenant colonel, and the first Asian American astronaut. He had flown on the first dedicated military shuttle mission the year before. He was respected for his quiet competence and dedication. Gregory Jarvis, 41, a payload specialist, an engineer for the Hughes Aircraft Company. He was responsible for deploying a satellite on this mission. He had been scheduled to fly on 2 earlier missions but was bumped both times, once by a congressman. Challenger was his long-awaited chance. And of course Krista McAuliffe, 37, the payload specialist who was the teacher in space. A mother of 2, she had put her life on hold to embark on this adventure, not for personal glory, but for the cause of education. She had trained tirelessly to conduct her lessons from space, to bring the wonder of the frontier back to her students. These were not daredevils. They were highly trained professionals and a dedicated educator, representing a cross-section of American excellence. They had placed their trust in NASA, in the thousands of engineers and technicians who prepared their vehicle. They trusted that if there was a credible threat to their lives, the system would protect them. They trusted that someone would have the courage to say no. On the afternoon of January 27th, as the temperature in Florida began its steady plunge, that system was put to the ultimate test. The first teleconference began around 5:45 p.m. Eastern Time. The engineers from Thiokol laid out their case. Roger Boisjoli presented chart after chart, showing the history of O-ring erosion and its correlation with temperature. He explained the physics of resiliency, how the rubber would get harder, slower to respond in the cold. He described the near disaster of the 53-degree launch of STS-51C. His conclusion was stark and unequivocal. They should not launch if the O-ring temperature was below 53 degrees. The forecast for the next morning was for the temperature to be in the low 20s, meaning the O-rings could be as cold as 29 degrees. It was a condition so far outside their experience base that the engineers considered it an unacceptable risk. The reaction from the NASA managers was skeptical. Larry Malloy challenged the engineers' data. He pointed out that some colder launches had shown less erosion than some warmer ones. The data was not perfectly linear. He asked, "My God, Thiokol, when do you want me to launch? Next April?" The pressure in his voice was palpable. George Hardy was even more blunt. He stated that he was appalled by Thiokol's recommendation. He could not accept a new launch constraint, a new rule on the eve of a flight. The engineers were stunned. They felt their data was being dismissed, their professional judgment questioned. They were trying to communicate a complex engineering risk, but the managers seemed to hear only an obstacle to the schedule. The teleconference was a dialogue of the deaf. The engineers talked about physics. The managers talked about flight history. The engineers saw an unknown danger. The managers saw a lack of definitive proof of failure. The call ended without resolution, but the lines were clearly drawn. The engineers at Thiokol were recommending a delay. NASA was pushing back, hard. The stage was now set for a second decisive teleconference, one that would seal Challenger's fate. The Thiokol managers asked for a 5-minute caucus offline to re-evaluate their position. This caucus would stretch into a tense, agonizing internal debate. The point of no return was not a moment in the sky, but a moment in a conference room, where the voices of caution were about to be pitted against the immense weight of an entire program's momentum. Chapter 5. The Go/No-Go Decision. The night of January 27, 1986. Inside a conference room at the Morton Thiokol plant in Wasatch, Utah, the air was thick with tension. The company's engineers had just concluded a contentious teleconference with NASA, recommending against launching the Challenger in the unprecedented cold. Now they were in a private caucus, a moment intended for them to confer and solidify their position before rejoining the call with NASA. This short break would become one of the most scrutinized and controversial meetings in the history of engineering. On one side of the room stood the engineers, Roger Boisjoli, Arnie Thompson, and their colleagues. They were convinced they had done their duty. They had presented the data, highlighted the risks, and made a clear professional recommendation to delay the launch until temperatures rose to a safe level. They believed their management would support them. On the other side were the 4 senior Thiokol executives present: Joe Kilminster, Vice President of Space Booster Programs; Calvin Wiggins, Vice President of the Space Division; Robert Lund, Vice President of Engineering; and the highest-ranking official Gerald Mason, Senior Vice President. These men faced a different kind of pressure. They were not just evaluating engineering data, they were managing a crucial business relationship with their single most important customer, NASA. The customer was unhappy. The customer was questioning their recommendation. The customer wanted to fly. The caucus began with Gerald Mason turning to his team. The tone was not one of solidarity, but of interrogation. He started by asking Robert Lund, the head of engineering, to re-evaluate the data and the conclusion. The engineers once again painstakingly went through their charts, explaining the effects of cold on the O-rings, the history of blow-by, the near catastrophe on the 53-degree launch. They reiterated that they had absolutely no data for performance at the temperatures expected for Challenger's launch. It was a leap into the dark. Boisjoli, feeling the tide turning against him, became more and more agitated. He grabbed photographs of the compromised joints from previous flights and slapped them down on the conference table, pleading with his managers to look at the evidence, to not ignore the physical reality of what was happening inside the boosters. The debate grew heated. The managers pressed the engineers. Could they prove with certainty that the joint would fail? The engineers could not. They could only say that the risk was unacceptably high and completely unquantified. This was the crux of the problem. The engineers were being asked to prove a negative, an impossible task. They couldn't prove the seals would fail, but they had a mountain of evidence suggesting they might. The managers, hearing no absolute certainty of failure, began to frame the issue differently. The conversation shifted from, "Is it safe?" to "Can you prove it's unsafe?" Then came the pivotal moment. According to later testimony, Gerald Mason turned to Robert Lund and said the words that would echo through the corridors of engineering ethics for decades to come. He told Lund to take off your engineering hat and put on your management hat. It was a stark, explicit command to set aside the cautious, data-driven principles of engineering and adopt a perspective based on business and programmatic pressures. It was a request to subordinate technical reality to the client's wishes. The room fell silent. The engineers were in shock. Their professional judgment, their very identity as engineers sworn to prioritize safety, was being dismissed. Lund, who had initially supported his engineers' recommendation not to launch, was now visibly conflicted, caught between his duty as an engineer and his loyalty as a manager. The pressure was immense. A note from Thielkohl would force NASA to scrub the launch, creating a major political and programmatic headache. It would be a huge black eye for the company, potentially jeopardizing future contracts. The unspoken threat hung heavy in the air. After a few agonizing moments of silence, Lund's position began to waver. He began to look for a way to rationalize a go decision. He reasoned that the secondary O-ring would surely hold even if the primary one failed, despite the evidence from STS-51C that the secondary could also be compromised. The logic became contorted, a desperate search for justification. The engineers made one last stand. Arnie Thompson stood up and walked to the table, pointing at a chart. He argued forcefully that the cold would delay the timing of the seal, that everything they knew about the joint's behavior pointed to a far greater risk at lower temperatures. Boisjoli spoke up again, his voice cracking with emotion, stating that he honestly believed that if they launched, the shuttle would be destroyed. But the momentum had shifted. The decision was no longer in the hands of the engineers. It was a management call. Mason polled the 4 senior managers. 3 voted to approve the launch. Only Robert Lund, the engineer in a manager's role, still hesitated. Mason turned to him and said, "Am I the only one who wants to fly?" Finally, Lund acquiesced. He agreed to sign off on the launch. The decision was made. Thielkohl would reverse its recommendation. They would tell NASA it was safe to fly. Joe Kilminster was tasked with rejoining the teleconference and delivering the new verdict. The engineers were defeated, demoralized. Roger Boisjoli walked back to his office, feeling sick to his stomach. He wrote in his journal, "I feel helpless." Bob Ebeling, who had fought alongside Boisjoli, went home and told his wife, "It's going to blow up," back on the teleconference. Kilminster read a new rationale, one that had been hastily constructed to justify the launch. It concluded that while the cold was still a concern, engineering analysis had determined it was safe to proceed. At the Kennedy Space Center, Alan McDonald, the senior Thielkohl engineer on site, listened to this reversal in disbelief. He had supported the initial no-go recommendation, and was now being told his own company was overruling its engineers. When the teleconference ended, NASA's Larry Malloy turned to McDonald and asked him to sign the official paperwork approving the launch. In an act of remarkable courage, McDonald refused. He told Malloy, "If anything happens to this launch, I wouldn't want to be the person that has to stand in front of a board of inquiry to explain why I launched." Despite McDonald's refusal, the decision stood. NASA now had the official recommendation it wanted from its contractor. The final go for launch was given. The countdown would proceed. The system had failed. The checks and balances that were supposed to prevent a catastrophe had been systematically dismantled in a single night. The pressure to launch, the fear of the client, the ambiguity of data, and the subordination of engineering judgment to management prerogative had all aligned. The decision-making process had been corrupted. The 7 astronauts sleeping in their quarters, trusting in the system below them, had been betrayed. The countdown clock was now not just a measure of time, but a final, irreversible march toward a tragedy that a few brave men had seen coming, but had been powerless to prevent. Chapter 6. 73 Seconds. The morning of January 28th broke clear and cold over Cape Canaveral. The temperature at 11:38 a.m., the moment of launch, was 36 degrees Fahrenheit. The right-hand solid rocket booster, baking in the morning sun on one side and shaded on the other, experienced a significant temperature differential. The aft field joint, the one that had been the subject of so much debate, was estimated to be just 28 degrees, far below any previously recorded temperature for a launch. At T-minus 6.6 seconds, the Challenger's 3 main engines roared to life, their ignition sending a deep rumble across the Florida landscape. The entire shuttle stack tilted forward, a designed movement known as the twang, before settling back into its vertical position. This movement placed immense stress on the SRB joints. At T0, the command was sent to ignite the solid rocket motors. In an instant, the pressure inside the boosters surged from 0 to nearly 1,000 pounds per square inch. The steel casing of the right SRB, as predicted, bulged outward under the strain. The tang and clevis joint separated. The primary O-ring, made stiff and unresponsive by the cold, failed to move into the gap. The secondary O-ring, also hardened by the cold, was likewise too slow to seal the joint completely. For a critical fraction of a second, there was no seal. A pathway was open. At 0.678 seconds after liftoff, a tracking camera recorded the first visible sign of trouble, 8 distinct puffs of dark gray smoke, emerging from the aft field joint of the right SRB. This was the hot gas, at over 5,000 degrees, blowing past both O-rings. It was the physical manifestation of the engineer's worst fears. The smoke continued for nearly 2.5 seconds as Challenger cleared the tower. Then, miraculously, it stopped. A temporary seal was formed, likely by aluminum oxides from the solid propellant slagging over the breach. To the untrained eye, and even to many of the experts in the launch control room, the ascent appeared perfectly normal. The smoke was either missed or misinterpreted as debris or normal ignition events. The shuttle rose majestically, a pillar of fire and smoke against the blue sky. The cheers from the spectator stands were euphoric. Inside the cockpit, the crew was focused on their instruments, unaware of the mortal wound their vehicle had sustained. The ride on the solid rockets was notoriously rough, a violent shaking that made it difficult to read the displays. But everything on their screens looked normal. Commander Dick Scobie's voice was the picture of calm professionalism. 37 seconds into the flight, Challenger encountered the first of several high-altitude wind shears. The shuttle's guidance system swiveled the main engine nozzles to counteract the winds and keep the vehicle on its correct trajectory. These corrective movements placed new and powerful stresses on the entire structure, including the already damaged SRB joint. The temporary slag seal, brittle and fragile, began to crack. At 58 seconds after liftoff, a flicker of flame emerged from the weakened joint. It was small at first, a tiny, almost invisible orange tongue licking at the side of the booster. At that same moment, pilot Michael Smith, perhaps noticing the vehicle's performance or the flickering on a display, uttered the first words of concern from the cockpit. His comment was cut off, but his tone was questioning. A second later, the onboard voice recorder captured Scobie's response. Chapter 7. The Long Fall Down. In the seconds following the breakup of the Space Shuttle Challenger, a profound and chilling silence descended upon Mission Control in Houston. The confident, rhythmic call and response of a normal ascent had been replaced by a wall of static. On the main viewing screen, the single vector representing the shuttle had fractured into a dozen diverging tracks. The flight dynamics officer, or FIDO, a young man named Brian Perry, stared at his console, trying to reconcile the data with reality. His voice, when he finally spoke, was flat with disbelief. "FIDO, I have a failed vehicle," he reported to the flight director, Jay Green. The phrase was technical, precise, and utterly devastating. Green, his face a mask of controlled shock, polled his team, seeking any shred of information, any hope. "RSO, any data from the RSO?" he asked, referring to the range safety officer, the person with the authority to destroy the vehicle if it veered off course. The response came back, "Nothing. Flight." The range safety officer, watching the 2 SRBs careening wildly and uncontrollably through the sky, sent the destruct command, creating 2 more puffs of smoke in the sky, a final percussive end to the visible part of the tragedy. But the true human tragedy was not over. It was unfolding unseen, miles above the earth, inside the tumbling, shattered remnant of the crew cabin. The investigation that followed the disaster would piece together a harrowing timeline of what most likely happened to the 7 astronauts after the vehicle broke apart. The crew cabin was an exceptionally robust structure, designed to withstand the stresses of re-entry. While the rest of the orbiter was shredded by aerodynamic forces, the cabin tore away in one piece. The violent G-forces of the breakup would have been severe, but they were likely survivable. The evidence for this came from a painstaking analysis of the recovered wreckage, particularly the astronauts' equipment panel on the right-hand side of the cockpit, the pilot's side. After the disaster, salvage crews recovered a significant portion of the cabin from the ocean floor. Among the debris, they found 4 of the astronauts' personal egress air packs, or PEEPs. These were small emergency oxygen tanks, designed to be used in a bailout scenario. An analysis of these packs provided a shocking revelation. 3 of them had been manually activated. 1 belonged to pilot Mike Smith. Another belonged to mission specialist Ellison Onizuka. The position of the activation switch made it clear that it was highly unlikely they were triggered by the explosion or impact with the water. 1 astronaut, likely Smith or Onizuka, had to have reached up and turned his on. It was a conscious act. This discovery profoundly changed the understanding of the Challenger disaster. It meant that at least some of the crew members had survived the initial breakup. They were alive, conscious, and aware of their terrifying predicament. They were in a powerless, unlit cabin, tumbling through the thin, cold air of the stratosphere. The cabin's electrical systems would have failed almost instantly, plunging them into darkness. The communication link to the ground was severed. They were utterly alone. The fall from 65,000 feet would have taken 2 minutes and 45 seconds. For some portion of that time, the astronauts were alive. The cabin was not airtight after the breakup, and it would have depressurized rapidly. At that altitude, without an oxygen supply, consciousness is lost in a matter of seconds. The activation of the PEEPs was a desperate, trained response to this loss of cabin pressure. It was an attempt by the pilots and mission specialists to save themselves and their crewmates, but the PEEPs provided unpressurized air, not a pressurized oxygen environment. They were not designed to sustain life in a high-altitude depressurization. They were meant to help astronauts breathe if they had to bail out of the orbiter at a lower altitude, after it had descended into the thicker part of the atmosphere. They could not prevent the fatal effects of hypoxia at 60,000 feet. The question of how long the astronauts remained conscious is one that can never be definitively answered. It is a dark, painful abyss of speculation that the families and the nation have had to live with for decades. But the evidence suggests a period of awareness, perhaps only a few seconds, in which they understood what had happened. In those final moments, in the cold and the darkness, they were not passengers. They were a crew following their training to the very end. While this silent drama unfolded in the sky, the shockwave of the event was spreading across the ground. In the VIP viewing stands at the Kennedy Space Center, the initial cheers of the families turned to confused silence, then to dawning horror. The voice of NASA's public affairs officer over the loudspeakers, initially celebratory, faltered. "We have a major malfunction," he announced, his voice strained. The families were quickly and gently escorted away from the stands, away from the prying eyes of the media, to a place of private grief. Among them were Krista McAuliffe's parents, her husband Steve, and her 2 young children. Her students from Concord High School, who had been cheering for their teacher just moments before, stood in stunned, tearful silence. Across America, in thousands of classrooms, a generation of children witnessed the tragedy live. They had gathered to see a teacher go to space, to be inspired. Instead, they were given a lesson in mortality, a searing, unforgettable image of technological failure and loss. Teachers struggled to find the words to explain what they had just seen. The live broadcast, intended as a moment of national education and pride, had become a moment of collective trauma. The networks, caught off guard, cut away from the horrific images. But it was too late. The sight of the Y-shaped cloud was burned into the nation's memory. Back in mission control, the protocol for disaster took over. The doors were locked. No one was allowed in or out. Every piece of data, every note, every scrap of paper was impounded as evidence. The flight controllers, who just minutes before had been focused on the ascent, were now tasked with the grim duty of preserving the record of their own failure. Jay Green, the flight director, addressed his stunned team, his voice heavy with emotion but firm with resolve. He told them to document everything they knew, everything they had seen and heard, because a long and difficult investigation lay ahead. The long fall down was not just the physical descent of the crew cabin into the cold Atlantic. It was the fall of a nation from a state of innocence and confidence in its technological prowess. It was the fall of NASA from its pedestal as an infallible agency. It was the descent into a period of deep national mourning and painful self-examination. The search and recovery operation began immediately. It would be weeks before the crew cabin was located, and months before the remains of all 7 astronauts were recovered and returned to their families. Each piece of wreckage brought back from the depths of the ocean was another piece of a puzzle, a clue to a truth that was already known by a handful of engineers in Utah. That this was not an accident, but a failure that had been predicted, documented, and ignored. Chapter 8. A nation in mourning. In the hours and days that followed the 73 seconds of terror, the United States was plunged into a state of profound and collective grief. The Challenger disaster was not a distant event reported in newspapers. It was a personal tragedy witnessed in real time by millions. The raw, visceral shock of the explosion gave way to a wave of sorrow that washed over the entire country, uniting people in a shared sense of loss. The images were inescapable. Television networks played the footage of the explosion over and over, the fiery plume against the clear blue sky becoming a symbol of a promise shattered. Newspapers ran front-page photos of the faces of the 7 astronauts, their smiling, hopeful portraits now transformed into icons of sacrifice. The public's connection to this crew was deeper than with any before it, largely because of Krista McAuliffe. She was the citizen astronaut, the teacher who represented the aspirations of ordinary people. Her presence made the tragedy feel deeply personal. Every school child who had looked forward to her lessons from space felt they had lost their teacher. Every parent felt the loss of a fellow parent. Her death, and the deaths of her 6 professional crewmates, brought the abstract risk of space exploration into sharp, painful focus. On the evening of the disaster, President Ronald Reagan was scheduled to deliver his State of the Union address. He made the decision to postpone the speech, a rare move that signaled the gravity of the moment. Instead, he addressed the nation from the Oval Office. His speech, written by Peggy Noonan, is remembered as one of the most eloquent and comforting moments of his presidency. He spoke directly to the nation's schoolchildren, who were struggling to comprehend the day's events. "I know it is hard to understand," he said, "but sometimes painful things like this happen. It's all part of the process of exploration and discovery. It's all part of taking a chance and expanding man's horizons. The future doesn't belong to the faint-hearted. It belongs to the brave." He then paid tribute to the crew, concluding with a line that would become immortal, borrowing from the poem High Flight by John Gillespie Magee, Jr. "The World War II pilot, we will never forget them, nor the last time we saw them this morning, as they prepared for their journey and waved goodbye and slipped the surly bonds of earth to touch the face of God." Reagan's words provided a measure of solace, framing the sacrifice of the astronauts in a narrative of noble exploration, but comfort could not erase the questions that were already beginning to surface. How could this have happened? How could NASA, the agency that had put men on the moon, have allowed such a catastrophic failure? The search and recovery operation in the Atlantic Ocean became a grim, daily ritual followed by the nation. It was the largest and most complex deep-sea salvage operation ever attempted. Ships and submersibles scoured a vast area of the ocean floor, searching for the wreckage of the orbiter, and most importantly, the crew cabin. The work was slow, difficult, and emotionally draining for the sailors and divers involved. They were not just recovering pieces of machinery, they were searching for the remains of heroes. Each piece of debris brought to the surface was a painful reminder of the violence of the shuttle's final moments. The right solid rocket booster, the source of the failure, was located and recovered in sections. Its aft field joint showed the clear signs of the burn-through, the physical proof of the O-ring failure. On March 7, 1986, more than 5 weeks after the disaster, search crews finally located the crew cabin lying in 100 feet of water. The recovery of the cabin and the remains of the 7 astronauts was a solemn and private affair, handled with the utmost respect by the military personnel on site. The identification process was painstaking. Once confirmed, the remains were returned to the families for private burial. The astronauts were laid to rest across the country, in hometown cemeteries and at Arlington National Cemetery. Memorial services were held in Houston, the home of the astronaut corps, and in Washington, D.C., at the Johnson Space Center. Thousands gathered in a cold rain to mourn their friends and colleagues. The families of the Challenger crew, thrust into the national spotlight by their unimaginable loss, bore their grief with incredible dignity. They formed a bond, supporting one another through the darkest days. They sought not vengeance, but answers. They wanted to know why their loved ones had died, and they were determined to ensure that such a tragedy would never happen again. The nation's mourning took many forms. Flags were flown at half-staff. Moments of silence were observed at sporting events. Schools established gardens and scholarships in memory of Krista McAuliffe. The tragedy sparked a national conversation about risk, technology, and trust. For the first time, the public began to see the cracks in NASA's facade of perfection. The image of the space shuttle as a safe and reliable space truck was shattered forever. The disaster also had a profound impact on the generation that witnessed it. For many, it was their "where were you when" moment, akin to the Kennedy assassination for their parents. It marked a loss of innocence, a realization that even the most advanced technology, guided by the brightest minds, was fallible. It taught a hard lesson about the difference between ambition and hubris. As the initial shock and sorrow began to recede, they were replaced by a growing sense of anger and a demand for accountability. The whispers that had started on the night of the launch, the rumors of engineers' warnings being ignored, grew into a roar. The nation was no longer content to just mourn its heroes. It wanted to understand who had failed them. The stage was set for an investigation that would peel back the layers of NASA's bureaucracy and expose the deep systemic flaws that led to the loss of Challenger. The period of mourning was ending, and the period of reckoning was about to begin. Chapter 9. The Investigation. In the wake of the disaster, President Reagan moved swiftly to establish an independent body to investigate the cause of the accident. He knew that an internal NASA investigation would not have the public's trust. The body he created was the Presidential Commission on the Space Shuttle Challenger accident, which would become widely known as the Rogers Commission, named after its chairman, former Secretary of State William P. Rogers. The commission was a blue-ribbon panel of experts, a collection of some of the most respected names in American science, aviation, and public life. It included former astronaut Neil Armstrong, the first man on the moon, Sally Ride, the first American woman in space, and General Chuck Yeager, the first man to break the sound barrier. But the member who would come to define the investigation, who would cut through the obfuscation and bureaucracy to find the simple, terrible truth, was a man who was initially reluctant to even join the Nobel Prize-winning physicist Richard Feynman. Feynman was a brilliant, eccentric, and fiercely independent thinker. He had a deep distrust of committees and bureaucracies. He agreed to serve only on the condition that he would be free to conduct his own investigation, to ask his own questions, and to follow the evidence wherever it led. From the outset, the commission faced a wall of carefully managed information from NASA. The agency, in a state of shock and institutional crisis, presented a narrative of an unforeseeable accident, a bolt from the blue. They provided the commission with mountains of documents, charts, and presentations, often burying the critical information in a sea of irrelevant data. But Feynman was not interested in the official presentations. He began his own guerrilla investigation, talking directly to the mid-level engineers and technicians, the people who actually built and launched the shuttle. He quickly grew frustrated with the official channels. He famously remarked, "I have a principle, which is you must not fool yourself, and you are the easiest person to fool." He sensed that NASA as an institution was fooling itself, and he was determined to break through the self-deception. His investigation led him to the engineers at Morton Thiokol, and to the story of the O-rings. He heard firsthand from Roger Boisjoly and others about their desperate failed attempt to stop the launch. He learned about the history of O-ring erosion, the flawed joint design, and the critical effect of cold temperatures. While the rest of the commission was holding formal hearings in Washington, Feynman was digging into the technical details. He discovered a disturbing disconnect between NASA's engineers and its management. The engineers knew about the O-ring problem, and were deeply concerned. The managers, however, seemed to have a completely different, and far more optimistic, assessment of the risk. He found that the manager's estimate of the probability of a catastrophic failure was a wildly optimistic one in 100,000. The working engineers he spoke to estimated the risk to be closer to 1 in 100. This disconnect, this failure of communication, was at the heart of the problem. Feynman decided he needed a way to make this complex engineering problem simple and understandable to the public and to his fellow commissioners. He needed a moment of theater. That moment came during a televised public hearing, as a NASA manager was giving a dense technical explanation of the booster joint. Feynman asked for a C-clamp and a glass of ice water. He took a small piece of the O-ring material, compressed it with the clamp to simulate the pressure in the joint, and plunged it into the ice water for a few minutes. He then released the clamp. The piece of rubber, which should have sprung back to its original shape instantly, remained compressed. It was stiff, lifeless. It had lost its resiliency in the cold. In that simple, elegant demonstration, Feynman showed the world the cause of the Challenger disaster. He had cut through all the jargon, all the charts, all the bureaucracy, and revealed the fatal flaw in a way that anyone could understand. He turned to General Donald Kutina, another commissioner, and whispered, "I've proven my point." The ice water demonstration was the turning point of the investigation. It broke through NASA's defenses and forced the agency to confront the truth. The Commission's final report, released in June 1986, was a scathing indictment of NASA and its contractor, Morton Thiokol. It concluded that the cause of the disaster was the failure of the pressure seal in the aft field joint of the right solid rocket booster, but the report went much further than simply identifying the technical cause. It identified the true root cause as a flawed decision-making process. The report detailed the intense pressure to maintain an unrealistic launch schedule. It condemned the communication failures that allowed critical information about the O-rings to be ignored or downplayed by management. It introduced the concept of normalization of deviance, describing how NASA had become so accustomed to the O-ring flaw that it began to treat it as an acceptable risk, rather than the urgent safety warning it was. The Rogers Commission report was a landmark document. It forced a complete overhaul of NASA's management structure and safety culture. The shuttle fleet was grounded for 32 months, nearly 3 years, while the SRBs were completely redesigned. The flawed Tang and Clevis joint was replaced with a new design that included a third O-ring and a built-in heater. NASA's management was shaken up. Several key figures involved in the launch decision, including Larry Malloy, were reassigned or resigned. The agency was forced to create a new Office of Safety and to give its engineers a stronger voice, empowering them to stop a launch if they felt it was unsafe. Feynman, true to his independent nature, was not fully satisfied with the official report. He felt it did not go far enough in its criticism of NASA's culture of unrealistic risk assessment. He wrote his own appendix to the report, a personal and passionate essay titled Personal Observations on the Reliability of the Shuttle. In it, he famously wrote, "For a successful technology, reality must take precedence over public relations, for nature cannot be fooled." The investigation had revealed a truth more profound and disturbing than a simple mechanical failure. It had exposed the human frailties within a great technological enterprise, hubris, groupthink, and the immense difficulty of speaking truth to power. The loss of Challenger was not just an engineering failure, it was a human failure, a managerial failure, and a moral failure. The investigation provided the painful but necessary lessons that would allow the Space Shuttle program to fly again, but it came at the cost of 7 lives, a cost that the investigation made clear could and should have been avoided. Chapter 10. The Echo of Challenger. The legacy of the Challenger disaster is complex and enduring. It is a story of tragedy, but also one of transformation. The loss of the 7 astronauts was a wound that scarred the American space program, but from that wound came painful lessons that reshaped NASA and redefined our understanding of the risks inherent in human spaceflight. The most immediate consequence was the grounding of the Space Shuttle fleet. For 975 days, America had no independent capability to launch humans into space. The dream of routine, frequent access to orbit, was dead. The shuttle was revealed to be not a reliable space truck, but an experimental vehicle, far more fragile and dangerous than its proponents had admitted. During this long hiatus, the nation and its space agency engaged in a period of deep introspection. The redesign of the solid rocket boosters was a massive engineering effort, a tangible symbol of the lessons learned. But the more profound changes were cultural. NASA was forced to dismantle the can-do culture that had morphed into launch fever. A new emphasis was placed on safety, on listening to dissenting opinions, and on empowering engineers to voice their concerns without fear of reprisal. The chain of command for launch decisions was clarified, ensuring that safety officials had a direct line to the top of the agency. On September 29, 1988, the Space Shuttle Discovery thundered into orbit on mission STS-26, the return to flight. The crew was composed of veteran astronauts, and the mood was not one of triumphant celebration, but of sober determination. The successful mission was a crucial step in restoring confidence in the shuttle program, and in NASA itself. For the next 15 years, the shuttle flew dozens of successful missions. It deployed the Hubble Space Telescope, the Galileo probe to Jupiter, and the Ulysses probe to the Sun. It was instrumental in the construction of the International Space Station, ferrying modules and crews to build the largest structure ever assembled in orbit. The program seemed to have recovered, to have learned its lesson, but the echo of Challenger was always present. The disaster served as a constant, grim reminder of the thin margin between success and catastrophe. Yet, tragically, the lessons of Challenger were not permanent. Over time, as the memory of the disaster faded and a new generation of managers took over, some of the old habits began to creep back in. The pressures of budget and schedule never truly went away. The normalization of deviance, the very cultural flaw identified by the Rogers Commission, began to re-emerge, this time in relation to a different part of the shuttle, the foam insulation on the external tank. On February 1, 2003, almost 17 years to the day after the loss of Challenger, the Space Shuttle Columbia disintegrated during re-entry. The cause was determined to be a breach in the orbiter's wing, caused by a piece of foam that had broken off the external tank during launch. The Columbia Accident Investigation Board found chilling parallels to the Challenger disaster. Once again, engineers had raised concerns about the foam shedding problem for years. Once again, their concerns were downplayed by a management structure that had become convinced the problem was an acceptable, manageable risk. The Columbia report concluded that NASA had failed to learn the institutional lessons of Challenger. The echo had become a tragic repetition. The legacy of the Challenger crew is preserved not just in the memory of their sacrifice, but in the living tribute created by their families. The families of the STS-51L crew came together to create the Challenger Center for Space Science Education. Their goal was to continue the educational mission that their loved ones had embodied. Today, there are dozens of Challenger learning centers across the country and around the world, giving students hands-on, simulated space missions, inspiring them to pursue careers in science, technology, engineering, and math. It is a powerful living memorial, a testament to the belief that the crew's mission to educate did not end after 73 seconds. For the individuals whose lives were forever altered by that January morning, the passage of time has not erased the pain. Roger Boyce-Joly, the engineer who tried to stop the launch, was hailed as a hero by some, but he was ostracized by many in his industry. He left Morton Theo Cole and spent the rest of his life as a passionate advocate for engineering ethics, speaking to students and professionals about the moral responsibilities of their work. He was haunted by the disaster until his death in 2012, a man who carried the heavy burden of being right. The Challenger disaster remains a pivotal moment in the history of the 20th century. It was a public tragedy that unfolded before our eyes, a technological crucifixion that exposed the hubris at the heart of a great national enterprise. It taught us that the final frontier is not just a place of wonder and discovery, but also one of unforgiving physics and immense risk. It reminded us that the towering achievements of science and engineering rest on a foundation of human judgment, and that this foundation is fragile. The names of the 7 are etched in granite at the Kennedy Space Center's Space Mirror Memorial: Scobie, Smith, Resnick, McNair, Onizuka, Jarvis, McAuliffe. They were explorers, pioneers, and a teacher. They were part of a long, unbroken chain of humanity's reach for the stars, a chain forged in both triumph and tragedy. Their story is a cautionary tale, a lesson written in fire across the sky. It is an echo that continues to reverberate, reminding us that the path to the heavens is paved with courage, but it must also be paved with humility, with honesty, and with a profound respect for the cold, unyielding truth.